Welcome to this video where the subject is global editing. We've already talked about the fact that some images require global editing. Some then require additional editing via strategic editing, and even perhaps some finishing touches too. But not all images require that. If we're saying that some images may only require global editing, then what's going to determine whether global editing, which is going to be relatively quick and easy, is going to be enough? It's actually going to depend on a number of factors. Image subject, the content of the image, the lighting we have as we shoot the image, our exposure, that's going to play probably one of the biggest parts, and even the viewpoint to some extent. For example, have we included that bright highlight right near the edge of the frame or not? If we have, then global editing may not be quite enough. We may need a little bit of strategic editing to deal with that highlight. But if the highlight's not there, then of course global editing may be sufficient. There's also one other factor, and that's going to be you. We all see things differently, and as our skill levels increase, we tend to notice a lot more. So the global editing you may be satisfied with this year may not be quite so satisfying next year, because your appreciation, your knowledge and your skill levels would have improved. So with this image opened up into Adobe Camera Raw, let's do some basic global editing. I'm going to start by going up to my icons along the top just beneath the histogram, and I'm going to go to my lens corrections. I'm going to tick the box to remove chromatic aberration. Now the lighting in this shot and the fact that we don't have too many dark areas against light areas tells me that I'm unlikely to have very much chromatic aberration at all, but it's always worth ticking the box just to be sure. But I do want to tick to enable the profile corrections, and when we do that we just see that little movement in the image. It's not massive, but it does correct the problems of the lens. The lens in question, if you're interested, is a Canon 100 to 400mm lens, and up here you can see that it was actually used at a 300mm length. So let's go back to our basic tab. I think the next thing we can look at in our global editing is cropping. I think we can make more of the lizard, we can improve the composition, and we can very likely get rid of these highlights on the top edge at the top left and in the center, and to some degree on the right hand side. So I'm going to go to my crop tool and select it. I do want to make sure I've got normal selected, and you'll notice that I've got the show overlay ticked, because when I click and drag I want to be able to see my rule of thirds. There it is. So I'm going to pick up the top right toggle of the crop bounding box, and I'm going to drag it down a little bit. As you can see, I've just removed those highlights, which is going to be a bonus for us, and I'm going to move the cross lines here to be very close to the animal's head. I could go a little further this way, but I want to avoid that band of white on the tail. I want to come just inside that. I think I can possibly come up a little bit at the bottom, but not too much, possibly down a little bit more at the top, and maybe I could even lose a little bit from the left. But I think the composition there is pretty good. Now what I can do is hit the enter key and commit that crop. But when I say commit the crop, we never actually commit the crop when we're working on raw files. Let me show you what I mean. If I go back to my crop tool and I just click it, there we are, back to where we was a few seconds ago. So if I change my mind just a little bit later and I want to adjust the crop in any way, then I can come back and do it. But for now I'm happy to move on, so let's hit the enter key and we'll work from here. I'd like to draw your attention to the histogram at the top of the screen. You can see as I pull my mouse over this that we've got everything stacked up on the left hand side in the shadow areas and in the blacks. But we've got the histogram looking like this not because the image has been badly exposed, but because we're looking at a predominantly dark image. We've got quite a bit of shadow in the crevices in the stones. Now, when we was talking about the histogram in a previous video, I said we generally want to avoid straight edges up the left hand side and the right hand side, but in actual fact you can see we've got a little bit of a straight edge here, but when we look at the image it doesn't seem to be doing any harm at all. And what we find is, in practice, that we can accept blocked up shadows a lot easier than we can accept highlights where there's no detail at all. So I'm not concerned about the shadow areas here at all with this image. But if we was really bothered, then of course we could just turn on the clipping warning and we can see just how much we have, and to be honest, that is insignificant. So I'm going to turn that off and we're going to move on. What I find is the image looks a little over warm to me. Now I'm going to deal with the colour via the white balance tool, but I'd like to deal with that in an isolated video because that's an important part of our editing, but it is global editing for sure. But here I'd like to step around it if you don't mind, and we'll come back to that a little later. So when it comes to colour here, I'm going to look at increasing the colour a little bit, but also maybe just adjusting one or two of these sliders up here. Let's do the vibrance first. We have two. We have a vibrance and we have a saturation. Now we can think of the saturation slider here as a pure volume control for colour. It'll turn up all colours to the same degree. Now you can reset any of these sliders simply by double clicking them and they'll go back to default. What the vibrance does is it takes into account colours that are already pretty well saturated and it applies a sort of bias. So I find that in practice I tend to use the vibrance a lot more these days than I do the saturation. So I'm going to push that up quite high, something around there at least to start with. We can think of the tint as a corrective tool because we'd only move that if we thought the colour was wrong, but I'll double click to reset it. But with the temperature we can think of that more as a creative tool because we have personal choice as well as rights and wrongs, of course. So I could like my images warmer and I can warm them up, but in this case I think this image needs cooling down. So I'm going to double click, just make a mental note of the value there, 5.8, and I'm just going to drop this down just to cool the tones a little bit. And of course once I've done that, that's prompting me to go down here and maybe look at even a little more vibrance, because you can see now I'm getting the colours coming through the lizard quite nicely. If you look up to the top of the screen just below the histogram, what you'll notice is that the image was shot at 800 ISO. We're using a powerful telephoto here to be able to get 250 at f8. 800 ISO was used, so there's a little bit of noise in this image, but because it's been well exposed I think we can deal with that pretty effectively. So I'm going to enlarge my image to 100%. I can do that by double clicking the zoom tool here, which is very convenient. I can use the space bar and the hand tool appears and click and drag because I just want to look at an area like this so we can see the noise here as we try to defeat it by going to our detail tab, and we're going to be looking at noise reduction. Now what I'd like to do here is to step the luminance up to somewhere around about 30 in one go, because I find that's a nice way to be able to judge the difference between the noise I'm seeing now and what this slider is going to do. So to make a start I'm going to guess to some degree and just click, and if you were watching in this area you would have seen that nicely smooth out. Let me double click, keep an eye on the picture. There you can see the noise. Bring it back to around 30 and it looks pretty good. One thing I should say here is that you are watching a slightly compressed video, so there is a slight change in the quality of the video you're seeing. You would see a little more detail if you were sitting beside me as I record this in Camera Raw. But that looks pretty good. What I'd like to do is to return that to 100% now. I can do that by double clicking the hand tool at the top left of the screen, or with the zoom tool selected I can right click and just choose Fit in View. Now I could say that from a global editing point of view I think we've done a pretty good job on this image, and we wouldn't need to do very much more, if anything. But remembering what I said right at the start, the more you become familiar with the tools and what actually creates a good image, the more you'll see. There's just one or two little spots here I'd like to deal with. Highlight over on the left hand side, one or two along there, one down there, and this big one over here I'd like to do something with that. So to do that I'm going to go up and I'm going to select my spot removal tool. Coming over to the right hand side, I'm going to use it in the heel mode. The size of the brush you see here, I'm going to adjust that using the square bracket keys to the right of the letter P, exactly the same as we'd use in Photoshop with any of the brushes. You can see I've got the feather set to about 30, but it's not critical, and I've got the opacity at 100. In normal circumstances we would enlarge the image to do dust spots and little problems like this, so I'll begin like that by double clicking the zoom again, and I'll just drag over to that spot there and reselect the spot removal tool. Just going to make the brush slightly bigger and click. Now you can see that the red ring is where I'm fixing that area, and the green ring is where Photoshop believes it needs to take detail to make that repair. Now it seems to have done a good job, but if you want to just get those rings out of your eye line, look down at the extreme bottom right and you'll see a little box that says Show Overlay. You can either go over there and remove the tick, but a much quicker way is to just touch the V key. Now when you do that and look away from the image and look back, if you can't see where you've been working, then the repair is pretty good, isn't it? So what I'm going to do here is go up to the top, double click the hand, and I'll do the rest at normal size so you can see where I'm going and what I'm doing. But I do need to reselect the tool after fitting that image back on screen, and now the brush is rather large, so I'll use those square bracket keys. I'll click that one and you can see that's done a good job. There's a couple up here, one there, and one there. And I've spotted one over here. Let's have a look at this one too, because we can click and drag. We don't have to just click, we can click and drag and allow Photoshop to do its work for us. I'm going to touch the V key. Not too happy with that repair. I'm going to drag this down to this area here, hit the V key again. I think I'm more happy with that. Over to the right hand side, that part there. Let's have a look where it's taken that from. Not too keen on that either, so as you can see, look, I can quickly move it down there and take the repair from a closer position. And there, I think we can say we're done. So for now, I'm happy to open this image up into Photoshop and say that that's a wrap. Now one thing to remember when we've opened up this image is that we could now save this as a Photoshop file, a TIFF file, a JPEG file. But if we went back to Bridge at any time and opened up that thumbnail, Adobe Camera Raw will remember all of the changes we've made, because if you remember, we have them saved in the Camera Raw database. Now, because I've had a fair bit of experience of manipulating images in Adobe Camera Raw, I can look at this picture and say to myself, perhaps I can see one or two strategic changes that I'd like to make. But we've got to bear in mind what I said earlier on. We're all going to see things differently. And as our skill levels increase, then we will, without a doubt, notice more and more. So here is a rule of thumb when we start to process images through Adobe Camera Raw. If we've shot a good digital image to start with, it's got all of the detail within it, and we don't have any major distractions with highlights around the edges or problems of any kind, then generally speaking, global editing is going to meet most of our needs.